Good evening. I'm coming to you tonight with a story that reaches back nearly 3 centuries, a story that reveals the darkest corners of justice, superstition, and human cruelty. Tonight, we investigate the case of Janet Horne, the last person in the British Isles to be legally executed for witchcraft. Her death in 1727 marks not a triumph of law, but a chilling reminder of how fear can corrupt reason and how the vulnerable become victims. This is her story. The year is 1727, Scotland, the small town of Dornoch in the Highlands of Sutherland. By this time, the Age of Enlightenment is sweeping across Europe. Newton has published his laws of motion. Bach is composing his greatest works. Rational thought is replacing medieval superstition, or so we believed. But in the remote corners of Scotland, old fears still lingered. And in Dornoch, those fears would claim one final victim. Janet Horne was an elderly woman. The exact details of her age are lost to history, but what we do know is troubling. She was frail, confused, showing clear signs of what modern medicine would recognize as senile dementia. She lived with her daughter in poverty on the edges of a community that watched them with suspicion. And in 1727, that suspicion would turn deadly. The accusation came from neighbors, people Janet had lived among for years. They claimed she was a witch. But this wasn't just an accusation of dark magic or curses. The charges were specific, disturbing, and utterly bizarre. Janet Horne, they said, had transformed her own daughter into a pony and ridden her through the night to meet with the devil himself. There, in some unholy gathering, the devil had allegedly shod the girl like a horse with iron horseshoes. Let that image settle in your mind. A mother, her daughter, transformed, ridden like an animal. This was the accusation that would seal Janet Horne's fate. But where did such a grotesque story come from? What possible evidence could support such a claim? The evidence presented against Janet and her daughter was, if we can even call it evidence, based on 2 things. First, the daughter's physical appearance. She had deformities. Her hands and feet were misshapen, described by witnesses as resembling hooves. In 2025, we would recognize this as a congenital condition. Perhaps clubfoot, perhaps another disability. But in 1727, in a superstitious community desperate for explanations, it became proof of witchcraft. The second piece of evidence was even more damning in the eyes of the court. During her trial, Janet Horne was asked to recite the Lord's Prayer in Gaelic. She couldn't do it correctly. An elderly woman, confused, frightened, suffering from dementia, unable to remember words under pressure. And this inability to recite a prayer was taken as proof that she had renounced God and embraced the devil. These were the foundations of the case against Janet Horne, a daughter's disability, an old woman's failing memory, and on these foundations, a death sentence was built. The trial was conducted by Captain David Ross, the Sheriff Depute of Sutherland. By all historical accounts, it was rushed, potentially illegal, and utterly lacking in any semblance of fairness. Both Janet and her daughter were found guilty. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The daughter, somehow, managed to escape from prison. Historical records don't tell us how. Was she helped? Did guards look the other way? Did someone with a conscience realize the horror of what was happening? We don't know. She vanished into history, leaving no trace. But Janet had no such escape. The method of execution chosen for Janet Horne was burning. But they didn't simply lead her to a stake. First, she was stripped of her clothing. Then, her body was smeared with tar to make her burn more easily. She was placed inside a barrel and paraded through the streets of Dornoch. Imagine this scene. An elderly woman, confused, dementia clouding her mind, covered in tar, displayed for the town to see. The crowd gathered. Some likely jeered. Others may have watched in silence, perhaps uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but too afraid to speak. The procession moved toward the fire, and here is where the story becomes truly heartbreaking. According to legend passed down through generations, as Janet was being led to the flames, when she saw the fire burning, and in her confusion, in her dementia-addled mind, and she didn't understand what was happening, she stretched out her hands toward the warmth, and she said, "Oh, what a bonny blaze! What a beautiful fire!" Those may have been among her last words. A moment of simple, tragic confusion. An elderly woman warming her hands at the fire that would kill her. Janet Horne was burned alive in June of 1727. The exact date is disputed. A memorial stone in Dornoch bears the date 1722, but historians believe this is incorrect and that the execution took place in 1727. Even in death, even in memory, the exact details of her suffering are obscured. Janet Horne's death marked the end of an era. She was the last person in the British Isles to be legally executed for witchcraft. Just 8 years later, in 1735, the Witchcraft Act would be repealed across Britain, making it illegal to accuse anyone of witchcraft. But that came too late for Janet. No one was ever held accountable for her death. Captain David Ross faced no consequences for conducting what many historians now consider a mock trial. The neighbors who accused her, the witnesses who testified against her, the townspeople who watched her die. They all returned to their lives, and Janet Horne's name faded into history. For centuries, she was forgotten, a footnote, a curiosity. It wasn't until much later that historians began to piece together the true horror of what happened in Dornoch in 1727. But tonight, we must ask difficult questions, questions that echo across the centuries. How could this happen? How could an entire community turn against a vulnerable elderly woman and her disabled daughter? The answer lies in fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of disease, fear of difference. Janet's daughter's deformities frightened people. They needed an explanation, and witchcraft. Witchcraft provided one. But there's another question we must ask. Why was Janet specifically targeted? Historical records suggest she and her daughter were poor, marginalized. Without powerful connections or family to protect them, they were easy targets. And perhaps most troubling of all, was Janet Horne even mentally competent to stand trial? By every account, she was showing clear signs of dementia. She couldn't recite a simple prayer. She didn't understand what was happening to her. In any modern legal system, she would have been deemed unfit to stand trial. But in 1727, in a rushed proceeding driven by fear and superstition, her confusion was taken as evidence of guilt. Janet Horne's case was not isolated. It was the culmination of centuries of witch hunts that swept across Europe and the British Isles. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused, tried, and executed for witchcraft. The Scottish witch hunts were particularly brutal. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, more than 3,800 people were accused of witchcraft in Scotland. Approximately two-thirds of them were executed. The methods were horrific: burning, strangling, drowning. But by 1727, these hunts were supposed to be over. The intellectual climate had changed. The law was changing. And yet, Janet Horne died. She was an anachronism, a final terrible echo of a dark age that was supposed to have ended. What makes her case particularly disturbing is that people knew better by then. The irrationality of witch trials had been exposed, the injustices documented, and still, she burned. Today, in Dornoch, there is a memorial stone. It marks the spot where Janet Horne died. The stone is simple, unadorned, and as I mentioned earlier, it bears the wrong date. Even in remembrance, Janet Horne cannot escape the confusion and error that defined her final days. But the stone stands as a reminder of injustice, of cruelty, of what happens when fear overrides reason. In 2017, Scotland began a process of reviewing historical convictions for witchcraft. There have been calls to pardon those who were executed, including Janet Horne. But as of tonight, nearly 300 years after her death, no official pardon has been granted. Janet Horne remains, in the eyes of historical record, a convicted witch. But there are aspects of Janet Horne's story that remain unclear, details that don't quite fit, questions without answers. First, what happened to her daughter? She escaped from prison and then vanished completely from historical record. No death record, no further mention in any document. Did she flee to another town, change her name, live out her days in hiding, or did something else happen to her? Second, why was the trial so rushed? Captain David Ross conducted the proceedings with unusual speed. Some historians suggest he may have been under pressure. Others believe he genuinely believed in the accusations. But there's another possibility that's been whispered about for centuries. What if there was another reason Janet and her daughter were targeted? Property disputes were common in 18th century Scotland. Accusations of witchcraft were sometimes used to seize land, to eliminate rivals, to settle old scores. Did someone want Janet and her daughter gone for reasons that had nothing to do with witchcraft? We don't know. The records are incomplete. Lost to time. And then there's the most disturbing question of all. Was Janet Horne actually the last? She's recognized as the last legal execution for witchcraft in the British Isles. But legal is a key word. In remote areas of Scotland, in isolated communities, could there have been other deaths? Unofficial executions, murders disguised as accidents, people driven out of towns to die in the wilderness. The historical record is clear about one thing. Janet Horne was the last documented legal execution, but the undocumented, the hidden, the forgotten, those stories may never be known. Tonight, as we look back at Janet Horne's story, it's tempting to think of it as ancient history, a relic of a superstitious age, something that could never happen now. But is that true? Around the world, even today, accusations of witchcraft continue. In parts of Africa, Asia, and South America, people are still killed for alleged sorcery. The United Nations estimates that thousands of people, mostly women and children, are murdered each year after being accused of witchcraft. The specific superstitions may differ. The cultural contexts vary. But the core dynamic remains the same. Vulnerable people, marginalized individuals, those who are different. They become targets when communities need someone to blame. Janet Horne's story reminds us that persecution doesn't require belief in literal magic. It requires only fear, suspicion, and the willingness to dehumanize the accused. And those ingredients, those dangerous ingredients, and they exist in every era, including our own. Let's return for a moment to Janet herself. Not Janet the witch, not Janet the historical footnote, but Janet the person. An elderly woman, someone's mother, someone who had lived a long life. She had memories, experiences, joys and sorrows that we'll never know. And in her final days, onto her mind was failing. The world was becoming confusing, frightening, and instead of receiving care, instead of compassion, she was accused, tried, convicted, executed. Think about her final moments again, standing near the fire, confused, reaching out her hands. Oh, what a bonny blaze. There's something unbearably tragic about that moment. A brief flash of innocent wonder in the midst of horror. An old woman, her mind clouded by disease, finding simple pleasure in the warmth of flames, not understanding that those flames were meant for her. That image, that single moment, it encapsulates everything wrong with what happened to Janet Horne. She didn't understand. She couldn't defend herself. She was vulnerable, and they killed her anyway. So what is Janet Horne's legacy? What does her story mean nearly 300 years later? For historians, she represents the end of a brutal chapter in Scottish and British history, the last victim of a legal system that allowed superstition to override justice. For advocates of the wrongly convicted, she's a symbol, a reminder that the legal system can fail, that courts can be instruments of injustice, that we must constantly guard against the corruption of law by fear and prejudice. But perhaps most importantly, Janet Horne's story is a warning about what happens when society turns against its most vulnerable members, when difference is treated as a threat, when confusion is mistaken for guilt, when fear overrides humanity. Her story asks us to consider, who are the Janet Hornes of our time? Who are the vulnerable people in our communities that we fail to protect? Who do we scapegoat when we need someone to blame? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're necessary. As our investigation comes to a close, we're left with more questions than answers. The exact date of Janet's execution remains disputed. The fate of her daughter remains unknown. The true motivations behind the accusations remain unclear, and perhaps most mysteriously, why does Janet Horne's name still resonate today? Why does her story, out of thousands of witch trial victims, continue to be told? Perhaps it's because she was the last, the final victim of a dying superstition, or perhaps it's that image, that heartbreaking, unforgettable image of an old woman warming her hands at her own execution fire, saying, "What a bonny blaze." That moment has become iconic, symbolic. It represents the complete failure of justice, the total breakdown of human compassion. But there's something else, something that historians have noted but can't quite explain. In Dornoch, even today, locals speak of the spot where Janet died. The memorial stone stands there, but some say there's more to it than that. On certain nights and on cold Scottish evenings when the wind blows in from the sea, some claim to see a figure near the stone, an old woman, confused, looking around as if searching for something, and others report something even stranger. On the coldest nights of winter, when frost covers the ground, they say you can smell smoke near the memorial, not peat smoke from nearby fires, not wood smoke from chimneys, but something else, something acrid, like tar burning. Are these just stories? Local legends that have grown up around a tragic history? Perhaps, or perhaps, some part of what happened in 1727 has never quite left that place. Some echo of injustice, some resonance of suffering. Janet Horne died on a June day in 1727. She was the last person in the British Isles to be legally executed for witchcraft. But her story refuses to die. It's preserved in historical records, in memorial stones, in local legends, and now it's preserved in our collective memory. We remember Janet Horne not because she was a witch. She wasn't. We remember her because she was a victim of fear, of superstition, of a society that failed to protect its most vulnerable. Her execution was legal, but it was not just. Her conviction was official, but it was not valid. Her death was public, but it was murder. Nearly 300 years have passed. The world has changed dramatically since that June day in Dornoch. We've abolished laws against witchcraft. We've developed an understanding of mental illness. We've built legal protections for the vulnerable. And yet, Janet Horne has never been officially pardoned. Her name remains in the historical record that of a convicted witch. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps leaving her conviction in place serves as a permanent reminder, a scar on the historical record that refuses to heal, a warning that injustice once committed can never be fully undone. Tonight, we've investigated the case of Janet Horne. We've examined the evidence. We've questioned the trial. We've explored the mysteries. But some questions may never have answers. What was Janet thinking in those final moments? Did she understand what was happening to her? Did she feel the heat of the flames before the end? And in the centuries since, has anyone ever truly been held accountable for her death? These questions linger, like smoke on a cold Scottish night, like the smell of tar and fire that some say still haunts Dornoch, like the memory of an old woman's voice saying, "Oh, what a bonny blaze." Thank you for joining me for this investigation into one of Scotland's darkest chapters. Janet Horne's story is one that should never be forgotten because the moment we forget is the moment we risk repeating it. Good night.